Okay, so this week we're turning into a slightly different mode of approach to understanding capitalist economy, which is very much about questions of space and time. But before I get too far into that, I wanted to talk about an issue that cropped up last week when I was talking about double consciousness and the way in which in the Grundrisse capital is seen as both a civilizing influence at the same time as it's seen as a toxic, vulgar, alienating force. And I wanted to make a general comment about the way in which Marx sets up dualities of that kind right throughout his thinking. The easiest way to think of that is to look at the tactic he uses in structuring the argument in Volume 1 of Capital. So I'm going to spend a little time just talking about that. Marx's starting point in Capital is the concept of the commodity. And the commodity is, well, just a thing. And it is a unit, an indivisible unit, some kind. But Marx immediately kind of says of the commodity that while the commodity is just a thing, it has a dual character. It is a use value and it's an exchange value. Now, you can't go to the commodity and sort of inspect it to find out what its use value is or its exchange value is. You can't sort of say, well, that part of the commodity is the use value and here's the exchange value. You can't do that at all. The commodity remains a unity, but it has this dual use, if you like. And this duality poses a contradiction, which is if I want to use that commodity, I can't sell it. If I want to sell it, I can't use it. So Marx is kind of saying, I have this unity, which is the commodity, but it has this dual character. And then there is a question of, well, what happens when that commodity is taken into the market? Is the commodity taken into the market as a use value or as an exchange value? Which is it? The answer is no, the commodity is just taken into the market as a commodity. And there it is subject to exchange. And all commodities in a market have an exchange capacity. So what is it they all have in common? And so Marx then goes on to say, well, what they all have in common is something called value. And that value is about being a product of human labor. But then Marx says, so value is about human labor. But it then asks the question, what kind of human labor? And we introduce a duality. And the duality is between concrete labor and abstract labor. Concrete labor is the number of hours it takes me to make something in a particular place and time. Abstract labor is the average time it takes to make comparable commodities. So there's abstract and concrete. Now notice we had use and exchange value as a duality. Here we now have abstract and concrete. But the abstract and concrete come together in the act of exchange. And the act of exchange, however, again opposes a duality. And the duality is between buyers and sellers. You can't have an exchange system that doesn't have these categories. And buyers have, says Marx, a different way of understanding the world than sellers, even though all of us at some point or other play both the buyer and the seller role. And that then leads Marx into kind of saying, well, when we start to think about value, we end up with two ways of looking at value, relative and equivalent. And that actually is resolved into the money form. And the money form has a duality. It is a means of circulation, a medium of circulation, but it's also a measure of value. So what you see Marx doing here is it's kind of, I mean, you can have a little chain, if you like, of, well, there's a unity, then it gets divided, and there's a contradiction, and then it comes back together again. And then that gets divided, and a contradiction, but it then comes back together again. And you go on and on through capital like that. So you talk about absolute and relative surplus value. You talk about fixed capital and circulating capital. So Marx is always working with contradictions. And if you want to understand him, you have to, if you like, appreciate the way in which he's using these contradictions. And this is what, of course, makes Marx's economics so radically different from classical and neoclassical economics. Now, economists actually abhor contradictions. They detest contradictions. They regard all this stuff and talk about contradictions as a sign of incoherence and non-scientific thinking. And actually, there's a whole school of Marxist thinking called analytical Marxism, which also takes that position. I used to teach sometimes with G.A. Cohen, who wrote this book on Marx's theory of history, who was an analytical philosopher and also a Marxist. He detested contradictions. Whenever I talked about this and whenever I mentioned the word contradiction, he would jump up and down and scream and say, this is bullshit Marxism you're engaging in again. Well, it is a radically different way of thinking. Yes, it's the way I tend to think about things. Yes, it's the way that Marx tends to think about things. And it's very, very different from classical economics and neoclassical economics, in which contradictions are banned. So when I was pointing out this sort of two-faced double consciousness that exists in Grundrisse between capital as a civilizing force and a progressive force with all kinds of positive kind of ways of being in the world, and the contrast with it is also at the same time a force which is about toxicity, about alienation, about vulgarity and all the rest of it. I'm really sort of pointing to something which is some inherent in the very, very stuff of Marx's approach to thinking about capital, which is you would expect him right throughout his analysis to end up with some sort of duality. But that's the duality that he ends up with. So we're going to see some of that, of course, in what happens in this section 8, which is about turnover times. Sorry, no, I've got the wrong thing here. Well, we're doing section 7, right? We're on, which is about the space and time of turnover and realization of capital. Now, I was very tempted in this section to sort of take off like crazy, because a lot of the work that I work on is about space and time and the spatio-temporality of capital accumulation. And I had to restrain myself from kind of interceding too much in the text, even though I do that from time to time, as you see, and I think it's a good thing to do. So I'm going to do a little bit of that interceding in terms of my commentary on this text. Now, in this section, he begins by providing, I think, a very interesting sort of summary of where we're at, if I can get the right pair of glasses, where we're at in terms of our understanding of the theory of capital. And as he says, and I'd suggest you go back to that figure of the circulation of capital and think about that that I showed in the first class, because what Marx is kind of saying is in a sense, let's think about that circulation process. And he says the circulation of capital constantly ignites itself anew, divides into its different moments, and every moment will contain a contradiction. It's a duality. The moments have a duality. So it divides into its different moments and is a perpetuum mobile. That is, it's constantly in motion. And again, that is something which is very significant in terms of Marx's understanding of value, which is capital is value in motion, and the motion is always there. If there's no motion, there's no capital. So the motion is really significant. And then he goes on to say, in its circulation, capital expands itself. That's this evolutionary path of the growth of the totality. It expands itself and its path. And the speed or slowness of its circulation itself forms one of its intrinsic moments. How fast is capital moving around in that diagram which I gave you? That's one of the questions. It becomes, he says, qualitatively altered in circulation. And the totality of the moments of its circulation. Marx always has in mind, and I've often emphasized this thing about the totality. You come back into the idea of the totality of that circulation process, and of all the moments of its circulation are themselves the moments of its production, its reproduction, as well as its new production. So the production of the totality now, this is not the production of commodities, this is the production of the totality, the reproduction of the totality, and the production of new forms within the totality. So the totality is not a fixed item. It is something which is in constant expansion, constant change. As he says, then goes on, the circulation of capital is at the same time its becoming, its growth, its vital process. And then he goes on to sort of talk about the temporality of this process and what we've been looking at. The circulation of money itself now appears as determined by the circulation of capital. So that what you see there is money being sucked into the circulation of capital. Now the circulation of capital is starting to actually dominate the circulation of money. And again, what we have is, if you like, a circulation of money as one form, the circulation of money capital is another form, and one comes eventually to dominate the other. And here Marx also starts to look very closely at the questions of the relationship of circulation and production. And as I point out in this session, you have to be careful how he understands when he uses the word circulation. Sometimes he distinguishes between production and circulation. There are two different segments of that totality that we're talking about. Circulation is everything that goes on in the market, in realization, in consumption, in distribution, and all the rest of it, which is distinguished from production. So he'll say production does this, circulation does that. But then later on in the session, he kind of starts to talk about the fact that the circulation process as a whole is one in which production is just one moment in the circulation. So the circulation of capital is the totality of that movement, and production is one moment within the circulation of capital. So be careful when you're reading Marx, when he talks about circulation, to say to yourself, what kind of circulation is he talking about here? Just the circulation that's going on in the market and in distribution, or is he talking about the circulation within the totality? Because you get rather different consequences when you recognize the difference between those two situations. Now, this then immediately poses this kind of question of what is the length of time? What is the temporality of that circulation process? And here we get into something that is kind of immediately interesting. There are two ways you can think of this. One is you can say temporality is fixed. It's the movement of the stars, it's the movement of the earth, it's the night and day, it's the passing of the hours. Temporality is fixed. So we're going to start to think about things that happen within that temporality. How fast do things move within that temporality? But there's another way to think of it and say, well, actually, capital is fixing its own temporality. If you say, what is the temporality at work in financial markets right now? You would say the temporality of financial markets is radically different now from what it was back in Marx's time. People are using computers. They're exchanging things in nanoseconds. They actually have situations now where if you have a powerful enough computer, you can see somebody making a trade, and before they've made their trade, you can actually change the price of what they're trading for and get a bit of extra money out of the trade. So in effect, if you say what's the temporality of financial markets, it's certainly not the temporality by which I live my day. It is certainly not the temporality of agriculture, and it's not the temporality of other forms of production. So in that case, you would say time is not something which is given, it is something which is being made by processes. So that instead of saying processes occur in time, you say processes create a certain temporal world. And if you get into that temporal world, you then have to act in a radically different way than if you are in another temporal world, so that you start to think about the creation of different temporalities. There's a kind of interesting book by Harvey called Family Time and Industrial Time. And the central argument that she makes is the time of, say, the reproduction of a family and the years it takes to raise a laborer, for example, that temporality is moving at a certain pace. Whereas the temporality of industrial production and the technologies of technological production, industrial production, are changing all of the time. So that industrial time is different from family time. And how you match the two is a very significant problem. For example, Marx makes very clear here that one of the most important things about temporality and capital is continuity. That the continuity of the process is absolutely foundational. And continuity often means that the process has to work day and night. It doesn't acknowledge, between daylight and nighttime. And as a result, what you get is you get a tendency to say, okay, the production process has to be continuous over time, whereas family time is not like that. So how do you have people to adjust those two temporalities and the demands of those two temporalities? Furthermore, if you kind of say, well, you're training somebody in skills, how do you make sure that those skills are actually relevant when somebody becomes 18 years old and they go into the labor force? Because it may be by then they've been rendered redundant by technological change. So the whole kind of question of the relationship between industrial time and family time and reproduction of labor time, you get these distinctions. And that therefore different temporalities are very central to understanding what capital is about. And here Marx starts to introduce us to the idea of turnover time. What is the turnover time of capital? And it raises some fascinating questions, which maybe if I can isolate them, which are very, very significant for understanding the nature of what capital accumulation is all about. The turnover time is going to be very much about the speed with which value can be repeated. If I have a production process and it does something and it produces something once a year, say it's in agriculture, if I can come up with a new technology, maybe I can do it twice a year. There's been a lot of, if the natural breeding time of hogs is 1 litre a year, you can start to breed hogs to have 3 litres a year. And so what capital does is frequently do that, because that is a way in which changing the turnover time has very important impacts upon value. The value depends upon some kind of constant turnover time. And one of the things that I would want to do here is to talk about the way in which technological change is very often about speed up. But as Marx also points out, it's also about the annihilation of space through time. That is, it's not only about speed up, it's also about overcoming the friction of distance. It's about creating the possibility of spatial expansion, because space is no longer relevant just as space. It's relevant because of the time it takes to overcome space. How long does it take to get from A to B? If you're in a production process which needs transport and communications, then the speed of that transport and communications becomes terribly important. How can you get fresh flowers from Colombia into your corner grocery stores in New York City? Most of it is coming from Colombia and Ecuador and Andes. How do you do that? Well, if you had a horse and cart, you'd never do it. But once you have a sophisticated system with refrigeration and air transport and all the rest of it, you can do it. So you can look at all of those blooms on the flowers in the corner grocery store. They look mighty fresh. Well, they're mighty fresh because there's been a revolution in transport and communication structures to make that possible. That was not possible in Marx's time. It wasn't possible when I was younger. It's become something possible since. You can now get fresh fruits, which are very perishable, and they can be in New York markets, and you can get raspberries and you can get strawberries and all those kinds of things all year round. In my youth, you couldn't do that. You had to wait till June before you could eat strawberries. And you ate a lot of strawberries in June. And then they went away, and you had to wait another year before you got more strawberries. Unless you made jam, which is a different kind of way of taking strawberries. So the whole spatio-temporality of this world is shifting. And as Marx kind of says, this shifting is not something which is just sort of accidental. It actually constitutes, as he says, the fact that change of location is value producing, no matter where it occurs. It then follows that the means of transport or communication, they fall into the category of the development of the productive forces of capital. Technological changes in the transport and communication sector have therefore been hugely important in the history of capital. Just think of all of the innovations which are about overcoming spatial barriers, reducing spatial barriers. And a lot of that, by the way, also includes the social and political organization. Since 1945, there has been a persistent drive to reduce social barriers. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was very much about reducing tariffs and tariff barriers. And what was the WTO about, if it's not about reducing those tariff barriers? So you're trying to reduce all spatial barriers, the barriers which are socially constructed, politically constructed, as well as those that exist because of physical barriers and physical distances. That is, you're trying all of the time to create a landscape which is optimal from the standpoint of the free flow of capital, the continuity of capital through time. So you put tunnels through the Alps, you put tunnels, under the water, bridges and all the rest of it. You do all of these kinds of infrastructural things. So Marx puts it this way: the more production comes to a rest on exchange value, hence on exchange, the more important to the physical conditions of exchange, the means of communication and transport, become for the cost of circulation. Capital, he says, by its nature, drives beyond every spatial barrier. Thus, the creation of the physical conditions of exchange, of the means of communication and transport, the annihilation of space by time, becomes an extraordinary necessity for it. Now, this has always been a great... When I first read the Grundrisse, I was thinking, oh, wow, this is great. Somebody put the sorts of stuff I'm interested in, locational analysis and trade over space and time. Somebody's put that central to what the mode of production is about. People often ask me, as a geographer, why are you interested in Marx? And I say, well, this is a very good example of why I'm interested in Marx. Because Marx is telling me that the reorganization of space and time is not an accident. It is a compelling necessity for the accumulation of capital. And I can look at it two ways. That is, I can look at what has happened and say, oh, yeah, and there was some of that going on. Or I can say, that is what's happening right now. And you see it happening all around us. And that becomes part and parcel of our daily reality. Only insofar as the direct production can be realized in distant markets in mass quantities, in proportion to reductions in transport costs, and only insofar as at the same time the means of communication and transport themselves can yield spheres of realization for labor, driven by capital, only insofar as commercial traffic takes place in massive volume, in which more than necessary labor is replaced. Only to that extent is the production of cheap means of communications and transport a condition for the production based on capital, and promoted by it for that reason. That is, Marx is, in a sense, setting out a series of laws here, laws of motion of capital, which are about the annihilation of space through time and by the reorganization of everything that is going on. So this, as if you like, it's very interesting when people comment on the Grundrisse. This is always these kind of sectional readings. I read what the philosophers have to say about it and what the sociologists have to say about it and what Tony Negri says about it. I always forget about this annihilation of space by time, but I come along as a geographer and say, yeah, no. So this is the geographer in me coming out and getting sort of very excited about Marx situating this and the reconfiguration of spatial organization is absolutely foundational. And then Marx gets into, and there's a very interesting sort of section, I'm not going to go over it very much, but about building a road. Who builds the road? And what do they do with the road? And why is the road important? Well, obviously, if you're going to annihilate space by time, you're going to have to build roads. That's one of the ways you do it. Well, who builds them? And he kind of says, well, initially it's going to be the state, but as capital becomes more and more mature, what you find is that this is more and more built by capital. So you find, very large mega projects in transportation, which are now actually taking place in the realm of capital. I think primarily of things like the Channel Tunnel that put Britain into Europe, so that you could catch the train in London and end up in Paris about 3 hours later. This is kind of the sort of infrastructure, and that was a private enterprise. Guaranteed to some degree by state guarantees, but it was all financed by a consortium of banks which are going to do this kind of thing. Now, this is one of the things, however, that Marx concludes. All general conditions of production, such as roads, canals, etc., whether they facilitate circulation or even make it possible at all, or whether they increase the force of production, presuppose, in order to be undertaken by capital instead of by the government, the highest development of production founded on capital. Now, in Marx's day, to assemble the mass of capital which might be needed to do something like the tunnel, was very hard to imagine. But here is Marx, again, being very prescient and saying, as capital matures, so more and more of the production of this stuff, the production of space and time and so on, is going to be taken out of the state and it's going to be put into private corporate hands. And I think it was a sort of, here he is in 1858 saying this is what's likely to happen. And over the last, 150 years, that's more or less happened. And again, it's Marx kind of looking at it theoretically, seeing what it presupposes, but also suggesting that it posits that something of this kind is likely to happen in the future. And people sometimes comment to me in commentaries that it looks like it's all determined. Well, yeah, there is a sense in which it is highly likely, but I don't think that it's predetermined. And I don't think there's any teleology involved in this. It's just that, once this process starts, it has its own logic, its own kind of pathway, if you like. Things become path dependent and more of it goes on. And as he points out about the turnovers, there's a way in which the turnover times kind of dictate to each other. That if I'm in a complex business and I'm using many parts to assemble in, say, an automobile or a computer or whatever, then the turnover time of the parts producers becomes important. And let's suppose I'm making an automobile or I'm making a computer, and one of the parts is being made by somebody who can only produce one of them a year. Well, you'd only get one computer a year, and you'd only get one, way before it gets to that point, you get tremendous pressure on technological innovation in that contributor to the production process. Very strongly. And Marx kind of says in Capital, after you get the power loom, you had to have a supply of cotton, which was kind of in a sufficient. So you needed a massive increase in the supply of cotton, and it needed to be cotton in a certain kind, and that led to the development of the invention of the cotton gin. But once you started to have mass production of cloth and the like, what you need was to have revolutions in the dyeing and other industries. So what Marx kind of says, technological innovations which speed up in one part of a production process mean nothing unless you've got the speed up in all of the other parts of the production process. So there's a generalization of speed up. And that generalization of speed up becomes the norm. And when it becomes the norm, then everybody has to respond to it. So you'll get the shift system coming into the factories. You'll get all of the things start to. So within the totality, you can't have discordant parts within the totality. And if you have a discordant part within the totality, then that discordant part is likely to find itself the object of considerable innovation and considerable pressure in order to conform with the emerging temporality of the totality. And this is, I think, leads us to start to think more carefully about the space and time of capital, which leads in fact in around 282 Marx to in a way have a discussion about these different temporalities of different production structures, and as those production structures become integrated with each other, so the temporalities have to be coordinated physically as well as in terms of monetary flows. The monetary flows can be taken care of by the credit system, but the physical taking care of it has to be taken care of by innovations which are clearly directed to the innovation and to the annihilation of space through time. Now, perhaps the key thing here is to recognize that when Marx says, and he does it very clearly, that capital is value in motion, value in process, and that the process is crucial. When he sort of summarizes this in the following way, and I'll read you what I would have liked you to read in company with that figure 2 when you're thinking about the totality of the circulation process. Capital is now posited, he says, as not merely sustaining itself formally, but as realizing itself as value relating to itself, as value in every one of the moments of its metamorphosis, in which it appears at one time as money, at another time as commodity, then again as exchange value, then again as use value. The passage from one moment to the other appears as a particular process, but each of these processes is the transition to the other. Capital is thus posited as value in process, which is capital in every moment. It is thus posited as circulating from one form into the next. The point of return is at the same time the point of departure, and vice versa, namely the capital, the capitalist. All capital is originally circulating capital, product of circulation as well as producing circulation, tracing in this way its own course. This is where circulation is being treated as the totality of the movement of capital within the rest of it. Then we come to what's the spatiality of this. He says, capital travels in order to go from one of these forms into the other. To specific amounts of time, even spatial distance reduces itself to time. The important thing is not the market's distance in space, but the speed, the amount of time with which it can be reached. By that much, the velocity of circulation, the time in which it is accomplished, is a determinant of how many products can be produced in a given period of time, how often capital can be realized in a given period of time, how often it can reproduce and multiply its value. Thus, a moment enters into value determination, which indeed does not come out of the direct relation of labor to capital. This is a very surprising statement because Marx has insisted throughout that value can only be produced in production. Now, the production of change of location is value producing. So we can partly absorb the question of spatiality and annihilation of space by time into value production by the fact that you're adding value to the product when you transport it from its point of production to its point of consumption. That, in Marx's analysis, is adding value. But what this then means is that somehow or other we have to recognize that the value production which is going on at the point of production is contingent on the return of value in motion throughout it. And if it takes a long time to get back, then the capacity for value production is limited. If it can come back quickly, then it's not so limited. So the quicker you can come back, that is, the quicker you can move through circulation in the market, quicker you can get through all of that and the distribution and all the rest of it, the faster you can get to producing value. And since you the production of value is contingent on that speed because of the commodity chains which Marx has begun to isolate. Because of that, value itself, while it's still made in production, the conditions under which that value can be created in production are partially set by the overcoming of barriers to spatial movement in these other areas. So what Marx kind of says very clearly, and this is something that I would really want you to emphasize, value is created in production and it's realized in the market. And without the unity of production and realization, there is no value. So the speed with which the value production can be resumed depends entirely on the conditions of realization. And the conditions of realization in the market, there can be barriers. There can be physical barriers. You're going to go to China. It takes you 2 months to get to China and 3 months to get back. These are the kinds of things that Marx was looking at. How can that be then reduced? And the more you reduce those barriers, the more value can get constructed. So in a sense, what he's saying here is I'm not going away from the thesis that value is created only in production. But I'm going to say what goes on in production is contingent to some degree with what goes on in the circulatory process. And the speed and temporality of that process is foundational. And this is one of the themes that Marx takes up in his discussion of value in process. And I think that there are many other interesting features in this thing and in this section. But there's one moment where he relapses, if you like, into sort of almost philosophical speculation, which I think is kind of interesting, and I don't know what you might want to make of it. As he kind of says, capital posits the production of wealth, and hence the universal development of the productive forces, the constant overthrow of its prevailing presuppositions as the presuppositions of its reproduction. Value excludes no use value, i.e. includes no particular kind of consumption. Furthermore, every degree of the development of the social forces of production, of intercourse, of knowledge, etc., appear to it only as a barrier which it strives to overpower. Its own presupposition, value, and the motion of value, is posited as product, not as a loftier presupposition hovering over production. The barrier to capital is that this entire development proceeds in a contradictory way. The working out of the productive forces, of general wealth, knowledge, etc., appears in such a way that the working individual alienates himself, relates to conditions brought about out of him by his labor as those not of his own, but of an alien wealth. What is at stake here, he says, is not an ideal or imagined universality of the individual, but the universality of his real and ideal relations, hence also the grasping of his own history as a process, and the recognition of nature as his real body. I really like this statement, and I think it's kind of deep philosophical stuff, but I always like to think of my own history as a process. And I think we live life as a process. And what Marx is suggesting, that we need to grasp our own history as process and what that process might be about. And that this also requires the recognition of nature as our nature. So this is a kind of a reflection. Notice he goes on to say here that value is understood as a product of history and nature. And I also would note that suggests that history is lived as a material process rather than as the earthly realization of some higher order moral or ethical imperative. What Marx does is to suggest that it is in coming to terms with our own process that we can start to think about the kind of revolution in that process that might be less alienating and more emancipatory. And as he says a little bit just around here, the richest development of the individual rests on the highest development of the forces of production. This is going back to one of those themes we looked at last week about the civilizing influence, about the uses of technology for emancipatory purposes as opposed to the way they get used for other purposes of oppression. And Marx is very explicit here on 255 when he comes back to saying what I was saying just a few moments ago. The outstanding relation is that the circulation of capital realizes value, while living labor in production creates value. And it is that unity, contradictory unity between production and realization, that becomes very significant, particularly in relationship to the spatio-temporal organization of production. Now, one of the themes that I would have wanted to insert in here if I'd taken the liberty was to point out something rather interesting about the nature of space and space-time. There are three major theories of space and space-time. The first is that of Newton, which is called the absolute theory of space and time. And it underpins all engineering and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The second is the relative theory of space and time, which is associated very much with Einstein, relativity theory. And in this case, you can't talk about space in itself as if it is not connected to time. You're going to be talking about space and time. So you talk about relative because, as you see with Marx here in Transport and Communications, the relative distance is measured in time. I'm 6 hours from London and, about, 4 hours from Westchester on a bad night. So the relative space-time is very much a situation in which you are going to be talking about not spatial distance, but spatial distance as covered by cost and time of movement. The third theory of space-time is the quantum theory, quantum mechanics. Now, Einstein never liked quantum mechanics because it had within itself mathematical equations which always turned out to be correct, which was a real difficulty, with no physical connectivity identifiable between them. Einstein called this spooky action at a distance. So that's what quantum mechanics is about. It's about a relational theory of space-time. Now, when I look at space and time, I think about those three different things. And way, way back, when I was writing Social Justice in the City back in 1972, something like that, I said space is neither absolute, nor relative, nor relational. It is always all three in some kind of combination. Now, absolute space and time is the kind of space and time which is about property relations and boundaries in space and so on. You think of a map and you put territory on a map and you kind of say that is the absolute space, which is my control. I own that piece of space. And if anybody comes across that line, I'm justified in taking a shotgun and blowing them away, those kinds of things. So absolute space and time is a space of cadastral register, temporality. And when we look at the city, we look at certain things which are all about absolute spaces, places you can go, places you can't go, things which are fixed this way, fixed that way. So there's an absolute space of the city. But there's also a relative space of the city, which is a space of movement. It's the flow of money, it's the flow of water, it's the flow of energy, it's the flow of people, it's the flow of everything. And places are equidistant in space and not absolute. So the relative space-time is understandable enough. The real big problem comes with relational space-time. Is there a relational space-time? Interestingly, I always think use value is very much about absolute space and time. Exchange value is very much about relative space-time. What is value? Value is immaterial but objective. I think there's a way in which you can start to think about relational space-times operating within the city. And this is very much about anticipations, things that people do which they don't understand quite why they do them, but they get caught up. Spooky action at a distance. I always remember the huge march there was on February the 15th of 2003 against the war. Some people said, hey, we may go to war, we don't like that, we turn out on the street. Nobody in their right mind would have said that what happened might have happened. Millions of people all around the world came out, anti-war. They came out. Bloomberg didn't allow for a march in New York because he thought the demonstration would be so small that they could just go stand on First Avenue and wave a few banners. So many people came out in New York. First Avenue was full. Second Avenue was illegal to be, and they couldn't move. So the cops started arresting people on Second Avenue, and nobody could get out of the subway. And 2 million people were on the streets of Madrid, 1 million in Barcelona, 1 million or more in London, all around the world. And it was one of those moments historically where suddenly, even the New York Times afterwards said, it seemed to be there was some kind of expression of global opinion here. Because before that, the New York Times had been 100% behind the war. But after that, it kind of said, oh my God, there are millions of people who aren't. And it finally started reporting on the war and a little bit about the anti-war movement. So this for me was in some ways a relational event. 68 had the same atmosphere. All kinds of things were going on. Things were going on crazy. In Bangkok, the students suddenly erupted. In Mexico City, they went wild. It wasn't only Paris. It was in 1848. Same sort of thing. Began to look like spooky action at a distance. There was some relationality going on. And when people start to kind of anticipate that, yes, something is happening and I want to be part of it, then suddenly things shift and change dramatically. And I think for me, I would kind of say that when I think about value, I think about use value in absolute terms. I think of exchange value and in relative terms. And I think of value in relational terms. The value is saying something about the condition of labor worldwide. Value is not simply about the employment of somebody in Westchester. It's about the condition. It's about the condition of work, of laboring, of working worldwide. And there are times when that conditionality suddenly comes into great prominence, into great And there's a certain terror in the bourgeoisie when you see that happening. When suddenly, if you like, all of the controls which capital implants and through the police and everything else suddenly starts to be seriously challenged. And so you start to see things beginning to happen in major ways. And then, again, I recall being in Turkey when just about the time when Gezi Park was erupting. And I went off to Brazil about 2 weeks later, and the same thing was going on in Brazil. And I said, well, you know, this is so interesting. It seems to me I'm the person who's creating all of these eruptions. But it was a very spooky thing to suddenly find yourself, you know, and it wasn't as if somebody went from Turkey to tell the Brazilians what to do, or the Brazilians, people got in motion. And the motion became, in Brazil in 2013, or whenever it was, there were millions of people in 300 cities on the streets. About 3 years later, there were millions, but they were all on the right wing on the streets. So it's not as if spooky action at a distance goes all in one direction. No, there are certain ways in which I think the sensibility, and that then also comes back to this idea of grasping one's life as a process, and asking the question, what are we doing with it? You know, what is it all for? And the sense of that very frequently leads into revolutionary upsurges, which become very often unpredictable and very often inexplicable. And in the same way, however, that they can become inexplicable, they can disappear. Here we are in the midst of a war, and there's no very much of a visible anti-war movement. Why is there not something like there was last February the 15th, 2003, when millions of people turned out and said, enough of this nonsense. We don't want it to happen. Of course, they failed, but they at least made their voices heard. And they did change the discourse. Before that, I guarantee you, go back and read the New York Times before that, you would not know there was an anti-war movement. You would not have any idea that there might be some people around who are not in favor of it. New York Times 100% behind the idea, the drumbeat to war. When February the 15th occurred, somebody in the newsroom figured that there was something up, and maybe they were wrong to ignore the fact that there was millions of people around the world protesting that war. So spatiotemporality is, it seems to me, a very critical thing. And the way Marx introduces it here is, I think, fascinating. And I've always very much enjoyed these passages. And to me, like I say, if you get me going on at length, I'm likely to do so. But I don't see how it is possible to develop a theory of capital that doesn't talk about capital, space and time, and spatiotemporality and the capitalist mode of production, and doesn't recognize that spatiotemporality has been changed and is changing, and that the relative forms of spatiotemporality have become much more significant away from the absolute forms, and that there are actually right now all sorts of expectations which are, you sense if you go and watch Bloomberg financial news, that there's a certain fear of contagion right now in the banking sector. Something goes wrong somewhere, and suddenly somebody starts to say, hey. And you can see actually the powers that be are racing like crazy to say that nothing is, everything is guaranteed. It's okay. The state is there. We'll back you and all this kind of thing. Whoops. I'm sorry about Credit Suisse, but there we are. And my bet is that potentially Deutsche Bank will go under, or someone. In other words, these panics, if you like, often moral panics and financial panics and so on, can easily are contagious, and they easily spread. And they don't take much to get them going. And those the spatio-temporality, therefore, of the whole capitalist system is if you like, captive by absolute surplus value, connecting to absolute space and time, relative surplus value connecting to relative space and time, and then the whole kind of question of the other question of what if you like, the spatio-temporality of political panics and rumors and things like that, all kinds of things of that sort. You're living in a different world, but that world has very real consequences. As Marx says about value, value is immaterial, but it has objective consequences. The immaterial psychological state of financiers is one thing, and you can kind of say that is something which I cannot capture and I cannot tell, but it has political consequences. And we'll find out what that state is when we see what the consequences are. We've had a whole set of real kind of interesting financial bust-ups. The cyber currency that went under, then the bank that goes under. Watch out! There are all sorts of things going on, which I think we have to understand. Things can take place. Well, those are some of the comments that I would make about all of this. I find it fascinating. For me, this is a fascinating sector. The whole kind of question of road building and so on we'll take up in greater detail later when we start to look at fixed capital formation, because this is a fixed capital formation problem, but it's fixed capital of what Marx calls an independent kind, and it's a fixed capital which is often embedded in the land, and it has a different logic to it than the simple capital flow that are just depicted on that diagram which we began with. So let me get some reactions, responses, questions about pieces of the text. Yeah. We need I don't know. Can we get the
This might be getting ahead a little bit, given what you just said. But I guess the first question that occurred to me is, why does capital tend to incur the cost of infrastructure and not just kind of put the cost of building infrastructure on the state if it's not actually productive of surplus value, but is the precondition for the extraction of surplus value from circulation? Like, why would it not just keep letting the state pay the price of building infrastructure?
Yeah, well, it often does say, hey, that's a state business and leave it to the state. But there is something else going on here. See, let's suppose you're thinking about building a bridge, and it happens the bridge is going nowhere. Why would you build a bridge to nowhere? Well, the construction companies are very happy to build a bridge to nowhere, provided you pay them. The architects and the designers are happy to build a bridge to nowhere, provided you pay them. The steel producers are very happy to contribute steel to the bridge to nowhere, provided they're paid. Labor in all of those areas, like steel, are very happy. So the construction unions, for example, if a bunch of environmentalists get up there and start saying the bridge is a bridge to nowhere and it's environmentally destructive, you have a big demonstration, and lo and behold, the construction workers union turns up and they start beating. You see the story. In other words, a lot of this investment, and as Marx talks about this, a lot of the investment that goes into projects of this kind very frequently end up going bankrupt. They're not worth it. And I quote a couple of examples of that, like London subway system when it first. And Marx has a thing. The first wave of investors goes bankrupt. Then somebody comes along and they buy up all the tunnels for $1 or something, and they make a lot of money on it. So the second, they make a lot of money. Meanwhile, the people who made the tunnel have been paid. So there's a lot of incentive to build bridges to nowhere. And I think actually capital has been very expert at building bridges to nowhere. The example I always use is the example of this airport south of Madrid in Ciudad Real, which cost 2 billion euros, and they couldn't find any planes to fly to it, so it went bankrupt. And they put it up for auction, and somebody offered, 5 million euros for a 2 billion airport, but it wasn't taken. But all the construction companies did fine out of the whole thing. So what you've got to do when you ask a question like that is to sort of say, well, what other interests are involved? Now, what Marx does here is another thing which we're going to hit later on, which is to say investments of this kind frequently undertaken with the idea that they would yield interest only. For instance, if your bridge to nowhere actually turns out to go somewhere because somebody builds something on the other side, and you start to have a lot of people using the bridge, and you have a toll booth there, and you collect money, and you get an income stream, and you're generating so much income per day from the traffic. Now you can capitalize that flow and say the value of the contract is $1 billion or something like that, because it will, that's capitalized at the current rates of interest. As the rates of interest change, so it gets a different capital value. So what Marx then says, well, some people are interested in just gaining interest. For example, I don't have any interest in particular in construction or anything. I have no particular interest in that. What I do have is I have a pension fund which has a certain amount of money, and over the past few months I've been looking at it every now and again and getting very distressed because it's declining at some precipitous rate, but then it comes back. So I want a rate of interest on this. I mean, I have $500,000 in the pension fund. I want 5% rate of return or something like that, So somebody comes along and says, well, we built this bridge to nowhere, but it's now going somewhere, and you can get a 5% rate of return by investing in the bridge. So why don't you put your pension fund into the company that is managing the bridge? So you can. So Marx then kind of says there is this large segment of capital that will be doing things in return for interest rather than the full surplus value, because interest is only one half of the surplus value, the other being profit. So why? So we would do that. So there's a logic. There is a logic in all of this, and the road. The other thing about the road is, we said bridges to nowhere. how do you think about the road as a consumption item, and who is likely to pay to use the road? So it's a toll road. Who can? And Marx points out that with something like a road, you've got dual uses. It can be used for production. Somebody's carting iron ore or something like that to the steel mill. So it can be used for production purposes. It can also be used, says Marx, for taking walks. So it can use for consumption purposes. So here you have a situation where you have an item like the road, which is both for production and consumption. And sometimes the consumerism side of it is more important than the production side of it. And a lot of the time these days, it's more consumers than producers. A lot of places, particularly if it's tourist industry or something of that kind, then it'll all be caught up in what Marx calls the consumption fund. So fixed capital is for production, consumption fund, which is things like housing and things like that, also is important. So you can put it into housing, and I could invest in Blackstone, which is going to hear about later. So there are lots of reasons why capital would want to do this thing, even when it's not remunerative. And I actually remember Roosevelt at one point in the New Deal kind of said, we need to get people back to work. How do we do it? We build roads to nowhere. So the Blue Ridge Road, Blue Ridge Parkway, stuff going to Jones Beach, all those kinds of things. The WPA was a deliberate absorption of surplus capital without necessarily being bothered about whether they would ever be used. In fact, they have been used and often been used very well, but they're sorry.
Thanks. So my question is about credit and whether and how credit protects against barriers toward the realization of capital, and whether that's breaks in continuity of its flow that results in sort of negated capital or capital laying fallow. And I know there's a bit about the suspension of the chance element, but I was wondering if you could talk about it a little bit more.
Yeah, the credit, in the background to that, all that road building stuff was the credit financing. And this is, Marx's tactic in a situation of this kind is to say, well, this is the credit, but we're not ready to deal with that right now. So he tends to sort of mention it and make some few remarks about it, but then shies away from a full analysis. But again, one of the things he says when some of this stuff circulates in return for interest, well, interest is mobilized through the credit system. And if I put my pension fund into the bridge that goes to nowhere and it then starts to go somewhere, I can get an increase. So the credit system is there to help finance over a long time horizon. That is one of the big purposes. The second thing is that the credit system is also used to deal with monetary flows when the material flows are operating on very different turnover times. For example, if you're a cotton grower, your cotton crop only comes in a certain time of year. You've then got to get it to market, and you've got to sell it, and it maybe takes 2 months to get your money back. You've then got to use that money throughout the years somehow to the credit card, so you can see straight away that the relationship between the raw cotton producers and the cotton mills, which need a certain amount of cotton per day, that relationship is materially very different. But you can equalize the relations between the cotton producers and the cotton mill and the cotton mills. You can equalize that by getting monthly payments to the cotton growers or something of that kind. In other words, the credit system flattens out and smooths out what would be a very sort of sporadic and jumpy relationship in the money flows and makes the money flows sort of relatively smooth. So credit deals with differential turnover times. It deals with complex relationships between consumption and production and consumption and realization. That the merchant, in effect, will offer credit by buying up the totality of the production, which allows the producer to get back into the production process because they've got the money back from it even before it's been sold in the market. Then the merchant will take it into the market. So there are many different elements here, where both merchant capital offering credit, as you will see, if when you want to buy an automobile, very often you go from an office buying the automobile to an office that does the financing. So these are the ways the credit system starts to deal with that circulation which is going on, which I mentioned, where the acceleration of the circulation process pushes, creates more value by getting the money capital back into production at a faster rate. So speed up is very much within the organization of the credit system. And the technologies of the credit system have changed from Marx's days, obviously, to the point where now a lot of it is computer organized and computer traded, so that the temporality of the credit system has become much faster, much quicker, much more sensitive to nuances of change. So the credit system is not a static system. It is something that is perpetually open to technological change, which accounts for the fact that once upon a time, the people who were employed by banks were coming from, they studied Greek mythology or something of that kind. Now you find most of them are physicists who've done quantum mechanics and know how to apply the quantum computing tactics to market movements. And you can see there's something there called market sentiment, which is a very interesting thing to gauge. I was reading a book which is interviews with some of the top traders on Wall Street. And you think some of the top traders are deeply involved in things. And most of these guys came in and they said, we come into the office, we look at the newspapers, we watch Bloomberg Terminal, we do a few things like that, and we get a sense of market sentiment. And you say, what's that? How do you measure it? No measure of it. And then I trade on market sentiment. And that's why I'm so successful. It's because I'm very good at gauging market sentiment, which is what I mean about, how the spatial temporality of this is it's not at all the way I imagined it. I imagined these people with fantastic computers doing all kinds of calculations and ending up with something. Well, there's a sector in the credit markets which is doing that, and that's all. But that's all automated. There's no person is involved in that. It's just getting the equations right. But the people who do the trading without the credit, they do something different. But the whole positionality of the credit system in relationship to the dynamics of capital accumulation is a huge topic, and it's one that Marx hints at in the Grundrisse but never gets to. He does get to it some in Volume 3 of Capital, but even then, it's very, very tentative, and it's not at all a complete theory of credit, and we have to. That's one of the things that we need to work on to get a better understanding of how this works.
I have a question in relation to the physics models of space-time that you mentioned, and thinking about quantum space and the spooky action at a distance. The idea there is that there's two entangled particles, right? And they exist in a way that there's a probabilistic function that describes they could take on one of two states, right? And then they sort of exist in both states until a moment of observation, at which point one will take on one particular state, one discrete state, and the other the opposite. And in relation to the dualities that you have been talking about, I think this is a really interesting application of that sort of quantum model, where that observational incident could be kind of considered a moment at which time both parts of that duality exist, but even across space-time could exist separately. Like you mentioned, a buyer and seller. Like on the internet, for example, someone's a seller on eBay until, like, indeterminately until someone buys, and then they become actualized.
Yeah.
And I wonder if this is like a useful application of that kind of quantum theory thinking.
Yeah. Well, you should write a little article about it. It sounds great. I mean, I like the idea. You know, I get nervous about mentioning quantum mechanics. I try to understand some of it, but it's way beyond me. But I think what is interesting is that the mathematical rules that come out of it apparently have never been contradicted, and that therefore says, you know, something is going on here which needs to be. And of course, quantum computing is way the fastest, hardest sort of stuff, which is able to intervene in market trades in all kinds of ways. I wouldn't be at all surprised if there shouldn't be some regulation of quantum computing in financial markets. I don't know, but I don't know enough about that. But I always kind of thought it was kind of really interesting that when people talk about things like market sentiment and Schiller writes his book about animal spirits. Keynes talks about expectations and that about 2/3 of Keynes' general theory is about the psychology of expectations and how important they are in terms of gaining hegemony in financial markets and so on. So yeah, these things are there, and I think I don't know how to handle things like that, but what I see to some degree Marx doing at various points is to kind of say, well, you know, these issues are the ones that need to be grappled with, but it takes somebody with much more intelligence than me to get into this.
So I have a question going back to the annihilation of space through time, and I think it's a really compelling idea. This idea that like the physical distance between New York and Ecuador can be in some sense eliminated by like technological processes to speed up the connection between the two. I'm thinking that there's also another process going on where as the space between those 2 points becomes annihilated, they also become more different from each other. Like the site of production for the fresh flowers is going to be very different socially, politically, and spatially from the place where they're consumed. And so I'm wondering if that's like a necessary outcome of the annihilation of space through time, or what the relationship of that is to like this heightened difference between spaces.
Yeah, I think, we might have a tendency to think that the annihilation of space by time homogenizes everything. But it doesn't. What these techniques allow is, for instance, corporations looking for a site to put a factory. If you were doing this 100 years ago, you'd be looking for macro differences, that this is a much more economic location than that. Whereas now the techniques are such that even little differences, very small differences, will affect locational decisions. And local governments are very aware of this. They kind of say, what local incentive can I offer which is going to get Volkswagen to build the plant in my community as opposed to building it in Alabama or something like that. So actually very minor geographical differences start to behave, have a very big impact because of the ability to move very quickly from one place to another. The other thing that happens is that the notion of time horizon. When foreign automobile companies started to come into the United States in the 1980s, like BMW in Alabama, Toyota and wherever, when they started doing that, they tended to demand tax breaks and blah, 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 blah. But they would tend to reassure people that they would be there for 20 years or something of that kind. So it was worth the municipality giving the tax breaks because over 20 years you might recuperate it. But then it turned out a lot of the time they only stayed there 7 or 8 years and then left. Because somebody came up with a better tweak and a better deal over there. And particularly if you organized it so that the municipality built your factory. So you didn't build the factory and you could walk away from the factory and the problem is the municipality, it's not yours. Now over 20 or 30 year time horizon, it doesn't matter so much, but over a 5-year time horizon, it really does. So one of the things that happens with the annihilation of space by time is that the sensitivity to geographical differences becomes very much more nuanced. And ironically, when people say annihilation of space through time, you think, oh, that means space no longer matters. In fact, it matters more now than it did back then because now the very small differences there are between, say, Louisiana and Alabama in terms of, tax, whatever, make all of the difference and are going to affect the decisions. And they are going to want to affect them over a certain time horizon to know that the geographical landscape is going to be extremely vulnerable to and it has to be flexible and is going to be flexible. So the geographical differences become more significant, even the smaller differences.
Hi, I just wanted to make a quick comment about the sort of quantum superposition framing of the value relation. I thought it was quite interesting how, although Einstein grappled with this problem, right? He said famously that he can't necessarily prove that the moon is there when he doesn't look at it, but he knows that it is. So that framing of that relationship is interesting. Also, Einstein, the socialist, maybe, who knows, maybe that plays into it a little bit. I did have another question, though. you talked about how capital sort of incentivizes the annihilation of space through time, how it wants to minimize the distance in which the commodity has to travel in order to increase value. And you were speaking as to how that has an effect on keeping people close sort of to the factories in order to produce faster. I was just curious if there's any understanding of what cities looked like prior to capitalism to after capitalism, right? Like capitalism seems to have a very important effect on the development of cities and the structuring of cities. Could you speak a little bit into how cities have changed? And what would a city without capitalism look like?
Well, if the social relations change dramatically because capital has gone away, then you're going to have all sorts of issues about, well, how do you provide for the city? What's its food sovereignty situation going to be? How are you? You're still going to have the same technologies about spatio-temporality. So the question for socialism would then be, how do we use those technologies? Because a lot of inequality that exists in the world right now has a very specific geographical structure and is caught up with, all of the things that Marx talks about, but he's talking about the annihilation of space through time. All of those technologies are there. So one of the big questions that I think is around for urban planners and the like is to start asking the questions, well, what kinds of technologies do we want to see enhanced and which ones do we want to see diminished? I mean, I would personally be very much in favor of doing what the mayor of Paris says right now. We want to try and create a Paris without the automobile. And what would that look like? And we see little elements of that around here in New York, and and there are these ideas of closing off Broadway from some, but the automobile in New York City has fairly disastrous consequences for the qualities of life. Pretty much everywhere. So you ask what would be possible? Well, it would be possible then, because but then you've got a problem of, well, does that mean we don't want the automobile industry to exist? And if that doesn't exist anymore, what's going to happen in terms of employment in Detroit or wherever, in Alabama and so on? So yeah, there are big issues there. But the whole kind of idea, in a sense, what Marx is kind of suggesting is that the urge and to create the proper form of urbanization and proper form of the geography and locational structure, that is something which is very, very significant for the future of our cities. And I think there are many of us who are kind of interested in talking through that. Doug, hi. Yeah.
All right, we have time for a last question.
We're finishing class here. So.
Hi. I have a kind of annoying theoretical question about the unity between production and realization. Because, as I was reading the text, it did seem like he was saying that circulation costs as a barrier to realization can sort of decrease increase necessary labor time and therefore decrease surplus labor time, which does seem to me that means that it decreases the amount of value that has been created, right? So my question is, do you take it that realization can retrospectively change the value that was originally created in the production? So should we understand value as something sort of created in production and then fixed? Or rather, when you say we have to think about the unity of these two, we have to always be thinking of value in a kind of a motion in the totality of the circulation. I ask because when I told an economist friend of mine, he said, well, it sounds like effective demand plays a role in determining value. And he said that seems very close to neoclassical economics itself. So I'm just wanting your thoughts on this thorny question.
Yeah, in Marx's way of thinking, an increase in effective demand doesn't in itself create value. But insofar as new needs, desires, wants come on the horizon, so it will open up the possibility of new production, which will be value creation. So it's only when the effective demand, if you like, generates some impulse towards the expansion of production that you would then say that surplus value will likely increase as a consequence. This is the way in which actually Marx in that concept of totality, and that's where the idea of totality comes in, that you can't change one circulatory process in the totality without affecting all the others. So to say that production is the site where value and surplus value are created, yeah, is significant, but it is subject to all of these conditionalities. One of those conditionalities is that the market is free-flowing enough so it can absorb whatever is being created. If it can't absorb what's being created, you're going to get devaluation. So Marx is talking about barriers to consumption, which create devaluation, and that to relieve those barriers in consumption will therefore put it the other way around, and we'll get rid of devaluation, and there will be an expansion of value production by these impulses coming from the outside that kind of say, you know, I have new wants, needs, and desires, and I have the money to pay for it. So there's now a new market emerging for whatever it is, and that new market can be met by somebody setting up production and creating surplus value. So yeah, the point is that all of the moments within the circulatory process are connected, and so Marx says at some point in here, we have to recognize that connectivity, and therefore the connectivity is such that what happens in the realm of consumption is not isolated from what is happening in production, but its impacts on production, that value is only increased when the production process gets into motion. So that's how he's handling it. But yes, effective demand in bourgeois terms is not irrelevant to what Marx is talking about here. It's not irrelevant at all. But the way Marx will trace its effects depends upon his construction of the totality. Okay, I think we are about...
Yeah, we're coming close to time. Any last comments before our special event?
Were there any online comments? Okay. Okay, we have another event coming up immediately after this, a book launch on asset managers and the role of asset managers in actually very relevant to who makes the road and who benefits from the road. Well, the asset managers are heavily into this, so it's a rather interesting book by Brett Christophers, and having an event on that at yeah. Well, that's important. Yeah. Okay, thank you.